Well, good afternoon and welcome to Banking on Building Back Better. I'm Simon Thompson. I'm Chief Executive of the Chartered Banker Institute. And last autumn, I commissioned with our partners, the Social Market Foundation, a series of essays to explore how a stakeholder approach might help the UK economy bounce back from the pandemic and the critical role of banking and finance in all of this. The good news is we do seem to be bouncing back, with the IMF expecting the UK to grow by more than 5% in 2021 and the year after that, making it the fastest growing G7 country. How widely that growth will be shared, though, is another issue altogether, and one we'll be exploring amongst others this afternoon as we talk about a stakeholder approach. So I'm delighted to be joined by two of our authors who kindly contributed essays to our collection this afternoon. We have Charlotte Black, who's a non-executive director at Aberdeen Standard and formerly director of marketing and public affairs at Brewin Dolphin. Charlotte's also the founder of an interesting art tech business called ArtClear, which uses technology to develop a reliable register of artworks. And Charlotte's also a fellow of our Chartered Body Alliance partner, the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment. I know there'll be some members from there listening and watching, so you're very welcome. Charlotte's essay was titled Connecting Stakeholders with Their Capital, and we'll find out exactly how we might do that in a few moments. We're also joined by Frances Coppola, who also has a connection to the arts, but in her case it's music. Frances left banking after 17 years in 2002 to concentrate on a singing career, but returned to her first love after the financial crisis to write about banking, finance and economics. You'll almost certainly have read her in the FT, The Independent, amongst many other publications. Frances's essay set out the triple challenges of a post-COVID world. And no, those are not how many people can legally sit in a garden, which countries can I visit today, and have you got the PM's mobile number? But we'll find out more about the three challenges Frances identifies in just a moment as well. And let me also welcome James Kirkup, the director of the Social Market Foundation, the editor of our essay series. Many of you may know James as a journalist. He spent some 20 years covering Westminster for the Daily Telegraph and Scotsman, amongst others, and he still writes regularly for and appears in the media. And can I say a big personal thank you to James, to James's colleague Hannah Murphy at the Social Market Foundation, and to my colleague Matthew Ball for all their efforts on to put together our Banking on Building Back Better essay collection. Now, Charlotte, Frances and James were joined by a number of other contributors, including the Shadow Chancellor, Annalise Dodds, City Minister John Glen, and several bank chief executives. If you haven't read the essay collection, please do. It's available via the Chartered Banker website. As James wrote in our foreword to the collection, the concept of a stakeholder economy has a long history. It's not simply a recent fashion. And despite the easy media characterization of banks and bankers as evil, rapacious, red in tooth and claw capitalists, second perhaps only to owners of football clubs, the reality is, at least in the retail and commercial banking sectors, this is far from the case. And we see banks playing a key societal role in their responses to COVID-19, as comes across in some of the essays in this collection, where we find bank chief executives setting out how a stakeholder approach is not the latest CSR fad, but the essential foundation of their businesses and our profession. So over the next 45 minutes or so, I'll be asking Charlotte, Frances and James to expand on their essays and the collection overall. We'll explore some of the themes that have emerged from the essays about the roles of business, banking, financial services, building a more inclusive and sustainable economic model, and hopefully look at some of the challenges to that too. Please do contribute to our conversation and discussion too, using the chat function on Zoom. I'll do my best to try and include as many of the questions and points you raise as we go along. But let me start, James, if I may, with you. Perhaps could you tell us a little bit more about the background to the stakeholder economy approach? As I mentioned, it's not new, is it? And what common themes would you pull out from the essays, and which of those do you think have a chance of actually sticking or gaining political traction and sticking?
Well, no, I agree with all of. I agree with the premise of your question, Simon. That it's not new, and it is. It does have a solid future. What do we mean by a stakeholder economy approach? I suppose what we mean is that people, enterprises functioning in the private sector of the economy should take into account something as well as your shareholder value, as well as making profit. And really, I mean, I suppose I would argue that the pure idea of public companies as being solely about shareholder value and returning profit to the owners of capital, that's the aberration. That's been the sort of the modern departure from the history of of public companies. If you go back far enough to the original the origins of the incorporation of companies in the 19th century, limited company status was something granted by Parliament as a special privilege to the owners of companies to limit their liability. And it was understood that if you owned a company, that in exchange for that privilege protection that you were being given by Parliament and by law, then you owed something back in return. That your business should do something beyond just look to make profits. That you should take account of the interests of the people in places where you did business. And for a long time, that was never written down. It never needed to be codified because it was simply assumed that that was the way anybody operating a business would operate. And in the 1970s, along came Milton Friedman and there are other people like that who essentially start to argue that companies are just there to discharge their responsibilities to shareholders to make profit, and the rest is for somebody else. It's for politicians, it's for society as a whole. And I think what we're seeing, and you can almost draw a line between the financial crisis and then COVID, we're seeing a challenge or a reversion to the narrative that predates Friedman. A realization that companies are about more than just making profit. And you mentioned football earlier on, and we could come along to the ESL in a moment. I know nothing about football, but I can tell you that row this week illustrates that fact that just like banks, football companies, other companies have a responsibility to someone other than the people who own the capital invested in them. So that's one aspect of the stakeholder economy. I think there is quietly there is a real consensus building between the Labour and the Conservative parties at the moment around that as being the correct future and approach to capitalism. I think it suits the interests and agendas of both the big parties for that to be the future of the future of the UK political economy. So I think we will. They won't talk about it in these terms. They certainly won't admit that they agree. But if you were to look at that essay collection, I hope everybody does. In my little political world, the contributions from our politicians, John Glen, Annalise Dodds, I think if you were to anonymise those, take the names off them, read them next to each other, you'd be hard pressed to work out which one was written by Tory and which one was written by a Labour MP, because they're pretty similar in approach about what they want from markets, want from companies, want from the wider economy. So I think quietly, for all the cultural and social rows that are the two big political parties are having on economics, I think there is a quiet consensus forming that a stakeholder economy approach is the future.
Thanks, but then if your premise is right that there is some political consensus emerging, then I'm struck, and I'll turn to Charlotte if I may here, because Charlotte, in your essay you point out the widening gap that you see between corporations and executives and their workforce, customers and society. I think you talk about the apparent one rule for the boss and another for everyone else. So Charlotte, if I can maybe ask you, your own question that you pose in your essay, how do we make businesses and bosses more accountable and the rest of us aware that we're all stakeholders? Of course, this is what you address through your essay. So perhaps you could draw out some of the key themes for us.
Well, my feeling strongly is that everybody, or virtually everybody in the country today, really is a stakeholder or is an investor and a shareholder. We're all, and we all have an interest in capitalism working and being successful and flourishing, and also looking after the planet and doing the things that we want it to do. But we're all, most of us, blissfully unaware that we are connected or that we are stakeholders. And that's my feeling, is that really that there's very little engagement between the bosses, if you like, or businesses and their underlying customers and their suppliers and their shareholders, apart from via their investment managers who manage all this money on our behalf. I mean, every one of us is putting up our own savings as risk capital for these businesses, but we are not recognized or connected with it in any way. And so therefore there's a disaffection and a general fury and, you know, discontent with the way capitalism or businesses are perceived or how they behave. So my feeling is that the way to deal with that is to connect us all. We're all shareholders, is to give us some kind of connection whereby we can have a say, not through changing legislation, or I'm absolutely not for changing the Companies Act in order to try to be able to give people voting rights over, you know, shares for where they're separated by a huge long chain of custodians and so on, but whereby they can sort of through a poll and have a say about remuneration policies, you know, about, you know, how, at what point people are going to what point a company is going to deliver their net zero targets, or how they're going to implement those, and so on and so forth. The things that actually we really care about. And my feeling is that if you were aware that you were a shareholder in Tesco's, you would maybe choose to shop there because you'd want Tesco's to be a success rather than going to Morrison's, or you'd use Vodafone rather than, I don't know, EE. If you were a Vodafone shareholder, because you would have an interest in those companies doing well, and therefore which would, in a sense, in a roundabout way, is good for capitalism. But I think it would make capitalism much more accountable, and it would make us all feel better about it, I feel.
But as I understand it, the core of your idea is you use the word poll very deliberately, because it's not a vote, it's an advisory poll. So I guess, I mean, what happens then if that advice is ignored by boards? Does that not then bring us back to the
that's really where you have the sort of comply or explain, you know. And I'm absolutely really convinced about that. I mean, if we were to put legislation in place whereby every one of us, the tens of millions of us who had, you know, one or two or very small number of shareholdings had a vote, the whole thing would be tangled up in red tape, and the costs would outweigh any benefit. But I think if you have a poll, so therefore there's no legislative requirement really, and you just have an alert on your telephone to say that, you know, that there's a BP's AGM is in 2 weeks' time. Do you support the remuneration policy? Do you support this? And you could click through to get more information if you wanted it. And you could, and then that poll or a pie, the aggregate of those votes, it'd be just as easy to vote as it would be to delete it, really. So you could have your say, and then that poll in aggregate would be published. And then you could see how your investment manager, whoever manages your fund, your pension fund, how they vote in accordance with their underlying clients, the majority of whether they voted in, and if not, they need to explain why not. I think it's perfectly fair for an investment manager to say that they support the remuneration policy. You know, this guy's the best oil man in the world in the business, and we want him more than, but are they prepared to stand up and say why they're prepared to accept to support a remuneration policy against the wishes of underlying shareholders? But for example, like in the Foxton this week, I mean, I thought you've seen Foxton's this week, the shareholders voted, you know, being urged strongly to vote against the remuneration policy there, which seems hugely excessive in this time. And that pressure from shareholders has made a change. But I think so. That's, I think, the only way you could do it without making it very, very bureaucratic and complex and expensive and requiring audit trails and all of those things that you'd have to put in place if it was a legislative requirement. But with a poll, I think you could do it we could do it very cheaply, and indeed it's possible to do it now. Really, it's being done. It's being developed, that technology.
Great, thank you. So Charlotte, if we may, we'll hold your idea from your essay there for a moment, and we'll turn to Francis. So Francis, in your essay, you point out that many of the issues we think have been brought to the fore by the pandemic were actually already there and right in front of us. So yeah, perhaps, you know, could you expand on what you think are some of the most important of these, and are you kind of optimistic or pessimistic we'll make better progress on solving these? And also then, having heard Charlotte's idea, in what way do you think that might help or not help potentially?
The way I see it, there were three really transformations going on in the economy even before the pandemic. The first was the transition to the digital economy. The second was aging and the demographic shift. And the third is climate change and the environment. The first of these, the digitalization, has been accelerated by the pandemic. I mean, there's been the shift to home working, there's been the shift to online shopping. That was already happening before the pandemic, but it's accelerated considerably. And people have kind of learned very fast, really, how to do this sort of thing. I mean, we're using Zoom for this meeting, whereas not more than a year ago, it would have been in person. And we've all had to learn to do that. And in the course of this year, we've got better at it because we do. So that's one aspect that I think it's easy to see that as a pandemic effect, but it's actually not. It was already happening before. The second thing is aging, which I actually think is one of the challenges of our age, that we've got people living increasingly long lives and spending a sizable proportion of the latter part of their lives in what we know as retirement, which is historically anomalous. I mean, we only have to look back maybe a bit more than a century to see that at that time, most people worked until they died. Now, most people live for 10, 20, maybe 30 years after retiring. And during that time, they live on the returns from their savings, and they also live on a tax transfer from working people to them. And this is like a social contract, an agreement with younger people that younger people will fund them, and not just through the tax system, but also through their own savings. The idea that we save for our own retirements is a bit of an illusion, really, because the returns on savings always depend upon the actual activity going on in the economy, which is led by younger people, people working, people running companies. It's not so. Really, Charlotte's point about everybody being investors and shareholders, a high proportion of those are people who are not economically active. So the question is how we balance out the needs of people who are economically active and the people who aren't, and how we deploy all these immense pension savings that everybody is saving now, because we have these very long retirements, we're going to have to fund them, into productive uses, so that we actually have a productive and vibrant economy that can support us through our very long retirements. We don't want to give them up. We want to make them possible. And my third point, and this kind of plays to this really, is the whole question of climate change and environmental destruction. And I've put the two together because I think if we only look at this in terms of pivoting to net zero, we kind of miss the wider issue here, which is the general degradation of our environment, which actually threatens our existence as a species, so it doesn't necessarily threaten life on Earth. It's really sort of draws into question looking longer term and thinking, what kind of planet do we want to live on? And what can we do ourselves now and in the future to make it possible for this to be a planet, A, that we want to live on, and B, that we're able to live on? And it seems to me that that's the third challenge of our age. And I want to bring all of those three together and say, actually, we need to be channeling the energy that's gone into digitization and the money that's going into pensions into trying to curtail, shall we say, the trail of environmental destruction and move us to net zero. And I want to explore ways of doing that.
I think those 3 points come across very powerfully in your essay. I think one of the questions that I think that very much throws up, though, and coming back to this idea of a stakeholder approach, that implies there's a consensus amongst stakeholders, amongst everybody in society, about what some of the common societal values and goals and things are. But you've touched on issues of intergenerational fairness and things there. So a question for all my panelists, is there consensus around what stakeholders want to see, or in fact do younger generations want very different things from older generations? This then comes on to the points around who are the holders of pensions and investors, and who's running the economy and things like that as well.
Could I offer a first thought on that, Simon?
Yeah, of course.
I think the short answer is, well, is there consensus? No, I'm not necessarily sure there should be either. This is, if we're talking about sort of small d democratic exercise, different people will always have different views about what purposes to which they want to allocate their capital. And I think that's probably good and healthy. I think the aim for policy in the little world where I live among politicians and officials should be greater visibility and probably greater standardization of information about the non-financial impact of the allocation of capital, so that when we get to the tech nirvana that the chart has described of, I think what I think Charlotte is essentially hoping to see a sort of supercharged version of the pensions dashboard that the Department of Work and Pensions has been working on for about 100 years now, and I think is in theory going to start is currently scheduled for some sort of prototype use in 2023. At that point, you will be able to get out your phone, look at your auto-enrolled pension, and find out what your holding in big companies is. And that's the start of the revolution that the chart is very rightly describing. But I think matching that, there needs to be a clearer understanding, a better standardization, I suppose, of the metrics by which we can judge the social impact, the impact on stakeholders of the allocation of capital. And at that point, if it turns out that, I think, the generational point, if it is the case that people who are currently in their late teens, 20s, 30s, if they're going to prioritize decarbonisation, social justice in allocative choices over other things, great, they can do that. If it turns out that those of us who are slightly older and getting closer to retirement, and let's take a different view and think, I want to pile my cash into nuclear power and tobacco, because that's that is a democratic capitalism. I would hope that the returns to some of those investments will not be such that they that's encouraged. But I think you'll always there should always be a diversity of view, and what we need is a system of signaling and management that allows those diverse views to be communicated from owners down to the allocation of capital.
Yeah, which is very much the heart of your proposal, Charlotte. There is a communication of views, and of course the poll idea then allows that's good, but allows a divergence of views potentially to come through. But is there an issue though over who owns who owns shares in our economy? Because although it's a lovely idea that lots of young people will want to play an active role in ownership, the reality is young people at the moment, many young people struggle to get on the housing ladder, pay deposits, pay back student loans, and okay, we have auto enrollment, which is fantastic. But do we really have large generations or large numbers of young shareholders, or do we have a demographic of shareholders who are largely middle-aged and older?
Well, of course, people who are largely middle-aged and older have been saving for longer, and so have more savings. I think that stands to reason. But I think what I'm proposing is, as I said, is not a vote according to, or that your weight of your word is according to the size of your shareholding. I'm very much proposing a one man, one vote. So whether you've got one share or 100,000 shares, it's a one man, one vote kind of poll. Partly because it would be impossible it's impossible to deliver a voting system whereby underlying investors through funds can possibly vote those shares. I mean, if you own the shares directly, you can vote, but it might come on to engagement, which is the other big challenge here, I think, is getting people to do it. But I think that so I'm proposing something that's completely one man, one vote. So whether you've got you're 21 and you've got your auto enrolled pension, and you find out which of the stocks that your pension is invested in, which you can do, then you can have your say, and then you can see when that pie is published how your views stack up with everybody else, just like in any other poll. And I completely agree with James, it must be democratic. But if you find that your investment manager is not voting in accordance with your views, and your views are out of step with that particular investment manager, you have the option to change that. Because that's another thing I feel very strongly, is that ultimately, you should control who manages your pension. Auto enrollment, maybe not so much at this moment, but I think that will come, that the pot will follow the member, so that the member has got ultimate control and the incentive to look after that pension pot all the way through their life, rather than ending up with hundreds of different pensions because of how people move jobs much more frequently now than they did 20 years ago. So I think that's another change that we'll see coming, probably even before the pensions dashboard, which is quite a tangled project the way it is at the moment, and it's been constantly being put back and put back. So I have less confidence in the pensions dashboard delivering on its objectives than I do on us being able to connect with our underlying investments and being able to have a say.
Yeah. And you raised the issue of engagement there. That was what I did want to come on to that next. And in your essay, you talk about the need for an awakening of shareholders, sort of akin to the sale of council houses in the 1980s in terms of the political awakening that happened then. And Francis, you introduced the subject of climate change as well. I mean, is that one of the ways in which we can really engage people, if we can show people how the financial decisions they make and the financial decisions made by the businesses they invest in and the investment managers they work with can either work for the good of the planet or against the planet? How can we engage generations of people in this? Because we've been trying this for a long time, and it's.
I know. I actually think there's a real need for information, that people can only make decisions about even sort of what to vote in their poll if they have information, and the information is accurate. And there's an awful lot of misinformation doing the rounds at the moment, and I don't think people have any easy way of filtering it. But there's one particular area that I kind of want to push back on and say we actually have to stop thinking like this. And that is the idea that we have different generations, and different generations are somehow fundamentally different from each other and don't have the same interests. They aren't, and they do. So, for example, we have this idea that sort of baby boomers are somehow these sort of people approaching retirement who are only interested in their own retirement save, not really in anything that happens to younger people, and really quite down on younger people and dismissing them all as snowflakes and avocado toast consuming people who, if they only knuckled down, did a bit more and saved a bit harder, would be able to have houses like they could. And there are no doubt some baby boomers who think like that, but the people I know are actually desperately worried about their children and their grandchildren. And I think that a lot of people actually are desperately worried about their children and their grandchildren. They are concerned about the future of the next generations, but they don't have information. And equally, younger generations, I think, do need perhaps to understand that the older generations are more on their side than they think they are. There's a lot of very divisive rhetoric out there. So I actually want to push back on a couple of things. The first is the thing I mentioned before, this idea that we are self-sufficient through our lives. Once we've stopped being children, we are self-sufficient through our lives, that we save for our own retirements, we provide for ourselves. I think that is a fundamentally toxic idea, because it breaks the social contract that says that young people are supported by older people when they are small, when they're not able to provide for themselves, and that as people grow, they become supporters of the people who supported them when they were small, that it moves through the generations like that. And I really want to re-establish that idea that older people are in this too, because we need older people who, as Charlotte said, do control an awful lot of the capital in this economy. We need them actually to engage in this process of building up a digital economy, a financial economy, and a green economy for the very far future. Think for times that will happen, things that will happen after they are dead. It's very hard to give the unborn a voice and the children of today a voice, and we have to find a way of doing that, and that means engaging not just young people of today but older people too. And I think the key to this is information. I think people need better information, and they need to be able to trust that information. I don't have a solution to this, and others have ideas about how we can improve the standard of information and raise people's trust in reliable sources of information and enable them to push back against some of the misinformation that's doing the rounds. I think that would go a long way towards helping out on this one.
Yeah, well, there's a whole other webcast in here. And I guess James, as a former current journalist, I'm sure you have kind of strong views on this that we could go on to for an hour.
One or two, yes, but let's not go divert on that. I think so. As I think, Francis has quite rightly picked me up on my crude characterization of in generational difference. I suppose I should respond with violent agreement by saying, I don't mean for a second to caricature all people in their 20s as as holding a certain view and old people over 50 are holding another. I think there is some fairly consistent polling evidence that shows different people by age assign different salience to different issues. And I think, which I think is a fact. On the wider point about generational fairness, I think to come back to our fundamental discussion here about finance and sort of allocation of resource, I suppose. I absolutely agree with Francis that we've seen. Is one of the big concerns about what's taking place over during the pandemic. I mean, bluntly, the pandemic and the response to the pandemic has involved a great deal of economic disruption being visited on younger people who are less directly medically affected by COVID-19 to safeguard the welfare of older people who are directly affected. And now, those older people have also benefited from a great many things on the economic front, especially quantitative easing and the inflation of asset prices. And I hope this is that we can try and use the forcing mechanism of the pandemic and the response to try and start a little bit of a conversation about how we begin to reallocate some of that some of the capital that is effectively accrued in the hands of older generations due to some perfectly legitimate, probably inevitable macroeconomic policies. As a way of essentially renewing that social contract that Francis talks about, because we've asked young people to disrupt their economic and social lives, largely for the benefit of others. And I think it would be good to work out and talk about ways whereby we can engage a little bit of bluntly reallocation of some of that wealth. I mean, to advertise a different interest, Social Market Foundation. I mean, we are one of a number of groups and organisations keen to try and dismantle things like the pensions triple lock, which sort of are hard wires in the favouring of older generations through public money at the literal expense of younger people. I think that's the sort of thing that has to be on the table.
But is this because we have politicians who pay some lip service to the demands of younger generations, but as we know, and sorry to bring another generalisation, though, at least we think we know that younger people often tend to vote less. So the constituency for politicians are the older generations who actually vote for them. Then, so are we actually all in this together? That is essentially as close to a true fact as you'll get. It is true that the older people are the more likely they are to vote, and politicians naturally, because that's the system we've created, respond to people who vote. I mean, who decides? It's the people who turn up. So yes, I mean, this should be worrying everybody. I think there's also, to get into party politics, there are some troubling signs that that
sort of age split is being crystallized in the party system, that the Conservatives are becoming a party of older people, and Labour is becoming the party of middle to younger people, and having a political system divided along age lines, I think, is not a recipe for healthy debate. I know I'm contradicting what I said at the start about the convergence around economic policy, but I think yes, I think, I mean, long-winded way of saying yes, I think that's true, and I think it would be a good thing if more young people voted. And I think we'd see a better economic model emerging from economic policy if they did.
I think part of the problem with that is actually the fact that our population is aging. And so, I mean, I think the best example of that we've seen so far actually was the Brexit referendum, where if you actually analyse the voting figures, you can see that even if all young people aged 18 and over, the 16 and 17-year-olds weren't involved, as you know, had voted to remain, they still would not have been enough to swing the vote. The fact is we just have more older people, and so even if younger people vote more, their votes are not necessarily going to make a difference. And I don't know what we do about that. You know, these kind of the simple figures don't work in their favor, and so it's actually very easy to hit younger people. The only way you can protect younger people really is by engaging older people to say, we will not put up with this treatment of younger people. We've seen that a little bit in the pandemic, with parents getting very angry about their children's exclusion from school, and the damage to their education. But to my mind, we didn't see enough of it, because it was easy. It has been, and we saw this in the aftermath of the financial crisis as well. It was easier to hit young people than it was to hit older people, because young people actually are often quite protective of older people. I have to say, older people are not always so protective of younger people.
So I do wonder when we start using terms such as kind of stakeholder economy and talk about a social contract, whether that is a genuinely inclusive social contract, or whether it's a social contract that is sort of understood by, you know, some large proportions, but others are left behind. Which actually brings on to, we've got a question from Cynthia, which is a slightly different take on that one, but and I'll maybe broaden out, Cynthia, if I may, with your permission, the question a little bit, because your question is beyond involving different generations, how can we make sure that we're inclusive of people from different ethnic minority backgrounds, different social classes, individuals with disability? You give the example of investment banking, but I think we could broaden this out more generally and beyond just the employment sphere. Again, how do we make sure that some of the marginalised and disenfranchised voices are heard in a stakeholder economy, not necessarily through the political voting system, but through our financial and economic system?
Can I offer one opening thought on that, on the recruitment side? And this is another subject very dear to the heart of the Social Market Foundation. I think it's very helpful if banks, financial institutions, the financial services sector, and I think this is happening in a lot of cases, did more to open up its recruitment pool away from, bluntly, beyond people who went to Russell Group universities. I think there is there has been a tendency for recruitment to lots of the upper echelons of the financial services industry to be dominated by the products of a relatively small number of institutions, which are, and this is beyond out with the scope of the financial services industry to fix. But if you just recruit from Russell Group universities, you're going to recruit from a certain pool of people. So if you look to mechanisms that allow you to recruit from a wider pool, and I think degree apprenticeships should be a much bigger part of that. I think there will be a push in that direction from, it's already underway from big employers, from government, elsewhere. I think that would be a good start.
I mean, if I could just add, there is certainly, I think there has been quite a big move to introduce, there's got a number of apprenticeship schemes in the city throughout the financial services industry, and particularly I know that we, run them in Edinburgh and Newcastle and so on, and that's where most of our, and in London and our major centres, that we have apprentices in all of those sites and centres. So I do think that I think it does happen, but I think that, you see the people in the front line, and there's a very stiff competition for positions in the sort of in the executive side of the business, and it's incredibly competitive. And that inevitably, I do think those Russell Group University graduates do seem to get into pole position. But there is a start in that. I think it is certainly happening.
I mean, Francis,
yeah, I was just going to say, if I can widen that out a bit more, I mean, Cynthia specifically mentions investment banking, so I presume she's thinking about investment banking's role in helping to channel capital into other industries. So clearly there are issues here to do with the kinds of industries that investment banking is seen as helping to direct capital into. And that kind of raises questions, I think, about regulation of investment banking. And it also raises questions about regulation of those other industries. I mean, how are we going to increase transparency and inclusivity in industries? It seems a bit harsh to sort of pick on investment banks saying thou shalt not invest in these kinds of industries. I mean, we should be saying, well, why have we even got those kind of industries if they're not being inclusive? We need to be working to make all kinds of companies inclusive.
And I wanted to ask, one of the things you touched upon it, or you raised in your essay, Francis, and you did point out in your summary is that issue of the digital economy and the rise of the digital economy and its consequences, positive and negative for individuals, business and society. And I guess in the early days of the internet, we were told, at least, it was supposed to be a very democratic, equalizing, leveling up tool. I mean, do you think that's still the case, or actually is the fact that it's almost become, the digital economy seems to become a sort of winner takes all approach, driven by the kind of network effects and so on? So in fact, is it the very antithesis of a stakeholder approach? Can we have a digital stakeholder economy that's inclusive?
I'm actually quite concerned about the lack of inclusivity in the digital economy. So for example, one of the things we saw in the pandemic was a bifurcation in work between people who could work from home using technology and people who couldn't, and increasingly the people who couldn't work from home, the people who were working from home were dependent on them, because they were the people doing the deliveries, they were the people doing the healthcare, they were the people doing social care. They're the people whose job involves being physically present. You do your shopping online, but there's some physical people putting stuff in boxes and taking it to you in vans. I know they're starting to look at drone deliveries now, but then all that does is put a whole load of people out of work. So you have to think about the skills of those kind of people and whether there's a place for them in the digital economy. The fact is that many people still are disenfranchised. They don't have the skills to participate fully in the digital economy. That can include people who are older, that can include people who've not done so well in our education system, people potentially who have disabilities that make it difficult for them to participate. And we do have to think about the way in which digital technologies are favouring people who are intelligent, technically savvy, and I have to say male, because the computer science industry has become incredibly male dominated, and that is now showing up in the way in which digitization is proceeding. Some of the biases that we have as humans and some of the beliefs that young men have particularly tend to show up in the way we design things. The crypto industry, which I particularly talked about in my essay, is incredibly macho. It's actually very hard for women in that industry. And I'm not sure that this is progress. I think we should be far more inclusive in our new technologies, and the fact is we're not. So we need to be looking at ways of making it easier for people, for other people, for women, for minorities, for people with disabilities, and for older people to participate in these technologies, because otherwise we're just creating yet another segregated form of work.
And then it's also
there's no way I think that there is progress there, and in some senses you're saying that older people have many more advantages than younger people, but it is younger people who are able to engage more with the digital economy. And I think that I think that a lot of older people feel that they're excluded in that way, which is another challenge. I think another challenge that we have, that they're excluded from being able to use the digital economy. I mean, I just tried to ring. I've got old. I was just trying to get hold of Thames Water because my water's been cut off. The only way I can contact them is through Twitter or Facebook. I don't do Facebook, so therefore I'm pretty limited to be able to deal with that. I mean, I feel quite excluded because of that. So I think that younger generations sort of getting back to where we were in terms of connecting with your underlying, where your capital is or where your savings are, and being able to understand that you actually are a stakeholder and that you have an opportunity to have a say. I suspect that it'll be young people that will be much more active in that way than older people. Older people have been traditionally very, very difficult to engage with this kind of thing, even though they've built up far greater savings, as earlier. But I would think that on a one man, one vote, younger people will have a much bigger impact and will vote far more and will make their voice heard far more than probably older people. And they'll be very, very quick to be able to move between different providers and so on and so forth, where older people tend not to, they just tend to stick and so on. So I think that you would certainly see their influence come to bear quite strongly if they were able to have their say in the way that I'm suggesting.
And so are we arriving at a consensus here that for stakeholder economy to succeed, we need to make sure that is that everybody, whether it's different generations, whether it's different classes, whether it's a whole range of different groups in society, it's without everybody's voice being not just heard, but actually sort of respected, listened to, and where appropriate, acted upon. That's almost the precondition you need for a successful stakeholder economy, because otherwise we're probably not talking about stakeholder capitalism. We're probably talking about crony capitalism, where, as we're perhaps seeing, some people would say at the moment, if you have the right phone number, your voice can be heard, but if you don't, it may not be.
Yeah, I think that's it. Well, I think we are illustrating the central point quite well, which is effectively why do companies do what they do? Why do they allocate capital resource to certain activities, and in whose interests is that capital allocated? And I suppose you could stir us up. I'm just reminded, you listen to Francis and Charlotte, actually, to bring this back to the banking sector. As it's a vexed question, has been for a very long time. You come back to questions about the branch network and physical banking. And sort of statement the obvious, I suppose. If you were to take the pure Milton Friedman shareholder value approach to running a bank, you would minimize your branch network and say we'll have as few of these expensive concrete boxes as possible, with as few people in as possible to service our customers in the cheapest way possible. But as we all know, that's not exactly how banks do it. That's you have a social footprint, you have responsibilities beyond just making money, and so the question of, do you close a branch? How do you provide mobile banking for people in remote rural communities, and the rest of it comes up, and capital is allocated to activities that are not as profitable as others, because banks have a responsibility to stakeholders beyond owners. So I mean, that's partly why I say, I said at the very start, why the conversation we're having is an old one. And I'm sure we'll continue, but I think we shouldn't lose sight of just because we've been worrying about these things and talking about these things for a long time doesn't mean they don't still need to be fixed.
Yeah. I mean, let's maybe in the final few minutes then actually bring it back to banking. And thanks for the links, James. So obviously we had sort of 3 of the essays in the collection were contributed by bank chief executives. We had David Duffy from Virgin Money, Debbie Crosby from TSB, and Mikael Sorensen from Handelsbanken. Obviously, they're not here to talk about their banks, but thinking about the banking sector as a whole and sort of the banking sector's role in building back better from COVID-19. As observers, do you feel the banking sector's response has been largely positive? And what lessons should the banking sector try to take from COVID-19 and deploy as business as usual?
Well, I think that's the most enormous question, but
it is. I know it. I don't.
It's a huge question for sort of 5 minutes. I mean, I think one of the things that's really become very clear is that the banking sector, or certainly the investment management industry, has become very conscious that they have to be much more transparent about their environment, how they're holding their underlying investments to account on their environmental policies, their social behavior towards their customers and their employees. I think that's become, and the governance generally. So I think that we can only help push that further by allowing everybody to have a say in corporate governance in some way or another, if they choose to do so, but through some kind of, through this kind of method. And the more people that understand that they have a say, that the more we'll push that along. But there's no question that ESG now is the #1 issue, on board agendas about satisfying those requirements, and that those requirements are becoming much more stringent, and not just in the UK, but across the world, in Asia, and certainly, people are taking a very strong view about human rights and how companies that they're investing in and how they're behaving.
If I can talk a little bit about the banking sector, and because I think that, again, this is kind of the continuation of a trend that existed before the pandemic. You need to look back to the financial crisis, really, to see where banks have been going since then, because there are two key changes. One is, as part of the de-risking, a lot of them have pivoted towards wealth management, and also the growth of payments, not just in banks, but in fintech more generally, has very much concentrated upon ways of moving money, existing money around, rather than what we tend to think of as the focus of banks, which is to lend money, well, more recently in the form against property in the form of mortgages, but longer ago. And it's interesting that Handelsbanken were involved in this exercise to provide finance to small businesses, and that's a sector that is in sore need of finance. And that if we are going to have a green transition, it needs to be fully engaged in and financed, because otherwise we're dependent upon big companies to do all our climate change and green transition for us. And I don't think that's the way to have a thriving economy. So actually banks need to be fully engaged in this. And we need to look at ways of encouraging banks to get back to lending productively to small businesses, not as a sideline, but as a main activity. Too many of them don't. They are too focused, to my mind, on providing payment services, mortgages, and wealth management to an increasingly elderly population.
I think this is perhaps why we're seeing some of the new startup banks. Now we've got beyond the original sort of Monzos, they're trying to focus on the SME area, banks like Starling and so on. I think they see real demand there. Yeah, James, perhaps a final comment from you, then I'll have to wrap up, I'm afraid.
Well, a very quick thought that follows on very much from what Francis and you've just said, to slightly preempt or use some clues about some future SMF research that we're going to be publishing in May, I think. I think what banking as a whole needs is more competition. I think the issue of the problem that Francis rightly identifies of SME lack of access to finance is a real one. I think our conclusion is that the best remedy, this is not an original observation, the best remedy to that would be to inject more competition into particularly the business lending market. Now, there's a question about how much banks themselves can do to engender competition. There may be a role for regulation policy, but I think that area of SME lending business lending is somewhere where a better, more enlightened banking sector would be providing more access to finance for more companies of more, particularly more companies of a more diverse spectrum of ownership as well. That's where there's a good opportunity for banking to show its social responsibility, its how it's meeting its obligations to wider stakeholders.
Great. Well, thank you, James. Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Charlotte, for a fascinating and wide-ranging discussion. We managed to touch on quite a lot. We even managed to talk about your essays a little bit as well, which was lovely in passing. I hope our audience have enjoyed listening and learning as much as I certainly have. Both this afternoon, I had the pleasure of meeting you last week and learning from you as well then too. And thank you again to my colleagues Matthew Ball and Emma O'Sullivan for organising the essay collection and for the webcast today. So I mean, I know that the 30,000 members of the Chartered Banker Institute and the other members of the Chartered Body Alliance, and hopefully we've got some members from CISI and CI listening in too. We all share a powerful sense of purposeful professionalism, and we are committed to building back better and to creating shared prosperity for current and future generations, as are many others across banking and finance sectors and business communities as a whole. I mean, in fact, I can't see how banking can possibly succeed except through taking a shareholder approach where we are genuinely embedded within and working hard to support the communities in which we come from, the businesses that are born in those communities as well, that can create prosperity for all of us, not just for a few. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Francis, Charlotte and James again, and have a good afternoon, everybody. Bye-bye.